Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The locked room with no key. When Alex and Jenna first saw the house, it felt like fate. A sprawling Victorian on the edge of town. It stood with an eerie elegance, wrapped in years of stories hidden beneath its peeling paint and ivy-covered walls. The price was suspiciously low, but the couple chalked it up to its age and the local rumors about it being haunted. Neither Alex nor Jenna believed in ghosts. They were practical, grounded people, and for the first few weeks, the house seemed perfect until they noticed the locked door. It was on the second floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that always seemed a little darker than the rest of the house. The door was sturdy, with a brass handle dulled by time and no visible keyhole. Jenna had run her fingers over its surface, searching for a way to open it, but it was sealed tight. "Maybe it's just an old storage room," Alex had said, shrugging. "We'll get a locksmith out here eventually." But weeks turned into months, and they never got around to it. The locked door became just another quirk of their new home, like the creaking floorboards or the faint smell of lavender that occasionally wafted through the halls. One night, as Alex was unpacking boxes in the attic, he found something curious, an old, tarnished skeleton key. He turned it over in his hand, his mind immediately going to the locked door. Could this be it? He decided not to tell Jenna. She'd always been a little uneasy about the door, and he didn't want to worry her. Instead, he waited until she was asleep and crept down the hallway, the key clutched tightly in his hand. The key fit perfectly. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a small room bathed in moonlight from a single, uncovered window. Alex stepped inside, his breath catching. It was a nursery, untouched by time. A crib sat in one corner, its wood polished and gleaming. Toys were scattered across the floor, a wooden train, a stuffed bear missing one eye, a ball with faded colors. And in the center of the room, a rocking chair swayed gently as if someone had just been sitting in it. On the chair was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Alex hesitated but eventually picked it up, flipping to the first page. The handwriting was delicate, almost childlike, and it began innocently enough. A young mother's notes about her baby daughter. But as Alex read on, the entries grew darker. "She cries every night at 3:15, always staring at the same corner of the room. I don't see anything there, but she does. She's terrified. Last night, I heard it too. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. It said her name. It said Emily. He's coming for her tonight." The final entry was smudged, the ink blurred as if someone had been crying while writing it. Alex's hands trembled as he set the journal down. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. He turned to leave, but as he stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the house, and Jenna's voice called from their bedroom. "Alex? What was that?" He shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. "Nothing. Just the wind." That night, Alex couldn't sleep. The words from the journal played over and over in his mind. At exactly 3:15 a.m., Jenna shook him awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" "A baby. Crying." Alex sat up, his heart pounding. "Are you sure?" It's coming from. Jenna trailed off, her eyes widening. She pointed to the corner of their bedroom. From there, Alex followed her gaze. The rocking chair from the nursery was there, swaying gently as if an invisible hand was pushing it. The faint sound of a baby's cries filled the room, growing louder and more desperate. "This isn't happening," Alex muttered, throwing off the covers. He approached the chair cautiously, his hands balled into fists. "This isn't real." But it was real. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "Emily." The next morning, Alex and Jenna decided to leave the house. They packed what they could and drove to a motel, vowing never to return. But as they sat in the quiet of their room, trying to process what had happened, Alex pulled out the journal. He hadn't meant to take it, but in his panic, he must have grabbed it on his way out. He flipped to the last page, and his blood ran cold. There was a new entry, written in the same delicate handwriting. "You can't leave. She's here now." Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Alex, look." She pointed to the corner of the motel room. The rocking chair was there, swaying gently, and the crying began again. Story 2. The scratches behind the walls. Maggie's hands trembled as she held the key to their new home. "It's perfect," she whispered, brushing her fingertips over the wrought iron gate that framed the narrow, two-story Victorian house. The listing had called it a fixer-upper with charm, and at the price they'd paid, it seemed too good to be true. Brian, her husband, wrapped an arm around her shoulders and smiled. "We'll make it ours," he said confidently. "Just needs a little TLC. At first, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes with age, where every groan and creak has a story to tell." Maggie spent her days peeling faded wallpaper, discovering intricate wood paneling underneath. Brian focused on patching up the roof and replacing ancient fixtures. It felt like an adventure, a new chapter, until the scratching started. It began on a Sunday night. Maggie was curled up on the couch with a book while Brian watched an old Western on TV. The sound was faint at first, like a fingernail dragged lightly across wood. She paused, her eyes lifting toward the wall behind the television. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Brian muted the TV. The sound came again, a soft, insistent scraping from inside the wall. "Probably mice," he said with a shrug. "These old houses always have a few critters. I'll set traps in the morning." But the traps didn't catch anything. The scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent with each passing night. It migrated from room to room, always just out of reach, always just on the other side of the walls. By the end of the week, Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the unnerving rhythm, her mind conjuring images of tiny claws raking through the dark. Brian, ever the pragmatist, decided to investigate. On Saturday afternoon, he gathered his tools and cut a small square into the drywall of the living room where the sound seemed loudest. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stepping back. Maggie peered over his shoulder. Inside the wall, the wood was gouged with deep, jagged scratches, as if someone or something had been desperately trying to claw its way out. Nestled in the grooves were fragments of what looked like fingernails. Human fingernails. Maggie's stomach turned. "Brian," she whispered, her voice quivering. He pulled his hand away, shaking his head. "It's probably, I don't know, maybe a prank. Kids breaking in before we bought the place." But his voice lacked conviction. That night, the scratching grew louder. Maggie swore she could hear faint whispers, words just beyond comprehension. By morning, she was in tears. "We need to call someone," she said. "This isn't normal." The contractor arrived on Monday, a burly man named Joe who'd seen his fair share of strange things in old houses. Maggie and Brian watched as he inspected the walls, tapping and listening. Finally, he paused in the basement, his flashlight illuminating a portion of the wall that seemed slightly different in texture. "This here's been sealed up," Joe said, running his hand along the plaster. "You want me to open it?" Brian nodded, though his face was pale. "Go ahead." Joe broke through the plaster with a crowbar, revealing a dark, narrow crawl space. The air that seeped out was stale and cold, carrying the faint, sour scent of decay. Inside, they found a filthy mattress, rusted cans, and old photographs scattered across the floor. The pictures were faded, but the subjects were clear. Children. None of them looked familiar. "This ain't right," Joe muttered, backing out of the crawl space. "You folks might want to, get someone to bless this place or something." Maggie shivered, clutching Brian's arm. They thanked Joe and paid him, but the discovery left them both unnerved. That night, Maggie dreamed of small hands clawing at the walls, their voices muffled and pleading. She woke to the sound of scratching. Only this time, it wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was in the bedroom. "Brian," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Listen." The noise was louder now, frantic and desperate. It seemed to echo from every corner of the room. Brian sat up, his face tense. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and swept the beam across the walls. And then they saw it. A shadowy figure was crawling out of the wall near the closet, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its hands were bloodied, nails broken and raw from scratching. The figure turned its head toward them, and though its face was obscured in darkness, Maggie felt its gaze pierce her like a dagger. A low, guttural moan filled the room. Brian grabbed Maggie's hand, pulling her toward the door. The figure moved faster now, dragging itself across the floor. As they fled down the stairs, the walls around them seemed to come alive with noise, scratching, banging, whispering. It was as if the house itself was trying to keep them inside. They didn't stop running until they were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The house loomed behind them, its windows dark and uninviting. Maggie swore she could still hear the scratching, faint but persistent. The next morning, they packed their belongings and left. They never went back. The house was listed again within a week, but Maggie and Brian refused to talk about what had happened. They tried to move on, but the memory lingered, especially for Maggie. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake up and hear it again, that soft, insistent scratching, and she couldn't help but wonder, had they escaped the house, or had something followed them out? Story 3. The Portrait in the Attic. Sam and Lily had always dreamed of owning a house in the countryside, away from the endless hustle of the city. So when they stumbled upon the old Victorian on Orchard Lane, it felt like fate. The house had charm, a wide porch, gabled roof, and enough land for the garden Lily had always wanted. Sure, it needed work, a little elbow grease, as the realtor put it, but they couldn't pass up the deal. It was the first week after moving in, and they had spent most of their time unpacking boxes and cleaning decades of grime from the house's many nooks and crannies. On the third evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, Sam suggested exploring the attic. "We should see what's up there," he said, holding a flashlight in one hand and a beer in the other. "Who knows? Maybe we'll find something cool." Lily hesitated. She wasn't superstitious by nature, but the house had a way of feeling alive. Little creaks and groans filled the silence at night, as if it were shifting its weight like a restless sleeper. Still, she nodded and followed Sam up the narrow, creaking stairs that led to the attic. The attic smelled of mildew and old wood, the air thick and heavy. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, covered in layers of dust that looked more like ash. The beam of Sam's flashlight danced over forgotten relics. A cracked rocking chair, a trunk with peeling leather, and shelves stuffed with yellowed books. And then they saw it. Leaning against the far wall was a massive portrait, easily 6 feet tall and framed in intricately carved mahogany. The painting depicted a family of 5 standing in front of a sprawling estate. A mother, father, 2 sons, and a daughter. The daughter's face was scratched out. Lily stepped back instinctively, the hairs on her arms standing on end. That's creepy. Who scratches at a kid's face?" Sam shrugged, kneeling to get a better look. He brushed a hand across the dusty surface, revealing details that had been hidden by grime. The colors were rich and vibrant, almost too vivid for something that had likely been stored here for decades. "It's old, but it's beautiful," he said. "This might be worth some money. We should keep it." "No, we shouldn't," Lily said firmly. "That thing gives me the creeps. Let's just toss it." Sam laughed. "Come on, Lily. It's just a painting. Don't let your imagination run wild." Lily wanted to argue, but she knew Sam's stubborn streak too well. He hauled the portrait down the attic stairs and propped it in a corner of the living room. The scratched-out face seemed to follow her every time she walked by. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. The house felt colder than usual, and the silence was oppressive. Around 2:30 a.m., she heard it. Faint, distant sobbing. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer, unmistakable. It was a child crying. She nudged Sam awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. "Hear what?" "Someone's crying." He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's nothing, Lily. Go back to sleep." But Lily couldn't. She slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, her heart pounding with each step. The sound seemed to be coming from the attic. She climbed the stairs slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. When she reached the attic door, the crying stopped. She stood there for a moment, debating whether to open the door, but fear won out. She turned back toward the bedroom, only to stop dead in her tracks. The portrait was no longer in the living room. It was now sitting in the center of the hallway, leaning against the wall. "Sam," she screamed, her voice cracking. Sam came running, his face a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What the hell, Lily?" She pointed at the painting, her hands trembling. It was in the living room. I swear it was in the living room. Sam frowned, picking up the portrait. Maybe you're sleepwalking. Let's just put it back. But as he turned the painting toward the light, they both froze. The scratched out face had changed. Where there had been nothing but gouged canvas, there were now two faint, glowing eyes staring back at them. The next day, Sam agreed to get rid of the painting. They loaded it into the trunk of their car and drove to the nearest antique shop. The owner, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, recoiled the moment he saw it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "It was in the attic of our house," Sam said. The man shook his head. "This painting, it's cursed. The family in the portrait died in a fire, except for the youngest daughter. She vanished that night and was never found. People say her spirit's trapped in the painting." Sam and Lily exchanged uneasy glances. "Can you take it?" Lily asked. The owner hesitated but finally nodded. "I'll take it, but you need to leave now. This thing has a way of coming back." Relieved to be rid of the painting, Sam and Lily returned home and tried to move on. But that night, the sobbing started again, louder this time. When they went to the living room, their blood ran cold. The painting was back, leaning against the wall as if it had never left. The glowing eyes were brighter now, almost alive. They left the house the next day, never to return. The Victorian on Orchard Lane remains unsold, and locals say if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the faint sound of a child crying.